very pleased to introduce two for the moment, a third one is coming on the way, three of our visiting fellows. I'm going to jump right in without further ado, introduce all three of them, and then we are going to hear Alex's presentation, Tim's, and then Mirka's. That's Mirka's chair.
It's Mirka's chair?
Yeah.
All right, let me get another chair. Mary, you can sit here.
Oh, I'll see. Well, I have to go in like half an hour, so I have to go in half an hour, so I'll just sit.
Over there.
Would you like a sandwich?
Yeah, help yourself.
Grab a sandwich before I
Okay, thank you.
start recording.
This is vegetarian, I believe, falafel. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right.
Thanks.
Alright. So Alex Cain, our first speaker, is a PhD candidate and teaching associate in the philosophy department at Monash University, Melbourne, Australia. Her dissertation focuses on the relation between thinking and friendship in the work of Hannah Arendt. She has published on Arendt and Kant in Critical Horizons, Arendt Studies, and Colloquy. I don't know how to pronounce that. Alex's interests include ethical and political theory within the European philosophical tradition, with a special focus on community, solidarity, and friendship. At the Hannah Arendt Center, Alex is particularly interested in studying the marginalia in books, in Arendt's personal library, which, as most of you know, is here at the library, her personal collection of books, and as well as Heinrich Bücher's lectures on friendship. So we're particularly delighted that Alex can enlighten us a bit about the marginalia in this collection. Tim Wyman-McCarthy is a PhD candidate in the Department of Rhetoric at the University of California, Berkeley, where he's completing a dissertation on how the rhetoric of social movements has entered liberal social change projects. In this fascinating project, In Search of the Political, he aims to theorize the political grammar developed by elite human rights, development, and philanthropic institutions in their engagement with social movements. His research and teaching interests encompass histories of human rights, philanthropy and development, law and the humanities, post-colonial and settler colonial studies, socio-legal studies, narrative analysis and genre theory, and the intersection of literature and political theory. And then finally, Mirka Muilu, she's on the way, is a PhD candidate in media studies at Tampere University. Her interests are in science and technology studies, new materialism, and theories and possibilities of civil activity. So some nice possibility of conversation between obviously all three on the topic of friendship, but civil activity with Tim in particular. In her research, she interprets Hannah Arendt's theory of active life from the perspective of material media theory. The dissertation brings Arendt's conceptualizations into the discussion with the current debates of agency, and suggests that Arendt's way to understand the dynamic between the earth and the world offers a fruitful analytical viewpoint to politicize the material dependencies of virtual media cultures. So three great diverse presentations of current research in and around Arendt studies. And I'll hand over the word to you, Alex. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Jana, for organising today, and to the Arendt Centre and Roger for having me here as a visiting scholar. So I'll be talking today about friendship, as Jana said, and this is the topic of my PhD thesis, which I'm completing at Monash University in Australia. So firstly, I'll be giving you a little bit of background into the topic of friendship in Arendt's work. Then I'll be offering an instance in which Arendt seems to suggest that friendship is a private activity. Then I'll be offering an instance in which Arendt seems to suggest that friendship is a public activity. And I'll be highlighting one of Arendt's most treasured friendships, and that's her friendship with Karl Jaspers. And in that friendship, I want to show that it was treasured and valued partly for its private elements and partly for its public elements. Finally, I'll be briefly suggesting that Arendt's notion of amor mundi, which means love of the world, helps us to understand her notion of friendship. And we can understand, through that concept, we can start to understand her notion of friendship as a love of a tiny micro world, which is shared by the friends and involves a unity, but also a difference, a harmony, and also a kind of resistance. So we know that friendship was incredibly important for Hannah Arendt, since she once wrote to Kurt Blumenfeld that, quote, "Nothing in the world is as important as friends," end quote. Gershom Scholem has noted that Arendt was a genius at friendship, and many scholars have emphasised just how diverse and strong Arendt's circle of friends was. The notion of friendship comes up in nearly all of her works. Sometimes it's quite central, other times it's more marginal, and sometimes she's just mentioning it in passing. She discusses friendship in relation to Lessing's work, friendship as a type of thinking, friendship as both distinct from but also related to love, as we'll see in a moment, and friendship as respect, among other ways that she discusses friendship. She really discusses it in a multitude of ways, and that's been one of the challenges for me, to try to work out how she's using this term. So despite how important friendship clearly was for Arendt, there haven't been that many studies on the concept in her work. In English, there's just one monograph on friendship, and that's by John Nixon. He argues that friendship is located in between the public and private realms. In contrast, I argue that friendship is a kind of public that we find in private, so it's a kind of private public, and that it therefore doesn't quite line up with the strict distinction that Arendt has between public and private life. So Arendt did think that there was a very strict distinction between private and public life, and this is a kind of a matter of controversy in Arendt's work. She thought that some things really should be hidden and some things should be shown in public. So as I've just indicated, the discussions of friendship in Arendt's work do not easily slot into this dichotomy between private and public. For example, when Arendt had a falling out with Gershom Scholem over the Eichmann controversy, she wrote to him that, quote, "The fact is that I love only my friends, and I'm quite incapable of any other sort of love," end quote. In The Human Condition, however, Arendt distinguishes friendship from love, and she argues that, quote, "Love, in distinction from friendship, is killed, or rather extinguished, the moment it is displayed in public," end quote. A little bit earlier, in 1954, she wrote a lecture called Philosophy and Politics, and the argument in that lecture has quite a lot to do with friendship. And she writes that, quote, "The political element in friendship is that, in the truthful dialogue, each of the friends can understand the truth inherent in the other's opinion. More than his friend as a person, one friend understands how and in what articulateness the common world appears to the other, who as a person is forever unequal or different," end quote. We can see these private and public elements of friendship playing out in Arendt's friendship with Karl Jaspers. He was her advisor for her dissertation, but became a really close friend of Arendt's. In Hannah Arendt on Hannah Arendt, which is a conversation that Arendt had with her peers and is published in Thinking Without a Banister, Arendt says that, quote, "The disagreement," and this is the disagreement between Arendt and Jaspers in their conversations, "the disagreement was never quite resolved, but the thinking about such a thing itself became immensely richer through this exchange without reservations," as Jaspers called it. That is, where you don't keep anything back. You don't think, "Oh, I shouldn't say that, it will hurt him." The confidence in the friendship is so great that you know nothing can hurt. End quote. So Arendt seems to be valuing both some of the private aspects of this friendship, but also some of the public aspects of this friendship. There's a harmony or an agreement between the speakers, so between Arendt and Jaspers, that they themselves have established in the friendship. The friendship is exclusive, it excludes most others. Their spouses sort of came in and out of the friendship sometimes, but they also very much valued their time alone together to have discussions. There's a confidence in the friendship, and the term confidence has connotations both of an assurance or a surety, but also it has the sense of being able to confide in the friendship. So it has connotations of secrecy or privacy as well. This confidence, both the surety and the secrecy, means that the friendship can handle any opinion that might be said within the friendship. And this is what is supposed to allow for the communication without reservations, where nothing needs to be held back. So this agreement between the friends, which might just be a tacit agreement and may never have actually been spoken about, seems to hold the friends together in a unity, and as a unity excludes most others. Echoing the spirit of a Socratic dialogue, Arendt says that her conversations with Jaspers never reached a definite conclusion. They were never fully resolved, and that the value was in the endlessness of the thinking and talking about these things. So like Arendt says of thinking, which she makes clear she thinks is a private activity, the dialogue in friendship is endless and the friends need to come back to it again and again. But this friendship also seems to have public elements, insofar as the friends do appear to one another. A dialogue involves a duality, and Arendt makes it clear in thinking that a duality, quote, points to the infinite plurality which is the law of the earth, end quote. There is also an equalization between the speakers, where otherwise they are always already unequal and different. And this equalization is made possible through communication and speech, which is essentially public. But their friendship is not a site of mere agreement. There's an agreement between the friends that they can say anything without feeling hurt, but they can also criticise one another's opinions, actions, and so on. In other words, by virtue of the agreement, there is also disagreement. The two friends argue and resist one another, an activity Jaspers himself called a loving struggle. Their friendship is on one level a unity, and on another level kept alive by the difference and disagreement and resistance that they show to one another. So, in my thesis, I take up the notion of amor mundi, or love of the world, in order to try to understand Arendt on friendship. And to try to understand how friendship can be both a site of harmony or agreement and argument and disagreement. So after her husband died, Arendt wrote to Heidegger, saying that she and Heinrich had a little world of their own. She wrote, quote, "Between two people, sometimes, how rarely, a world grows. It is then one's homeland. In any case, it was the only homeland we were willing to recognise. This tiny micro-world, where you can always escape from the world, and which disintegrates when the other has gone away." End quote. So if we combine this notion of a tiny micro-world with the notion of amor mundi, or love of the world, we can see friendship as a kind of love, and therefore make sense of how Arendt can say that she loves only her friends, as well as how friendship can be both agreement and disagreement. and how it can have private significance and public elements. Like Arendt's friendship with Jaspers, a microworld is limited and exclusive and thus partially private. It's micro, but nevertheless has elements of public life. Equalization, difference, disagreement, appearance. Arendt had originally wanted to call the human condition amor mundi. She wrote to Jaspers, quote, "I've begun so late, really, only in recent years, to truly love the world, that I shall be able to do that now. Out of gratitude, I want to call my book on political theories amor mundi," end quote. Amor mundi is a love that both pulls the lover towards the world out of gratitude that it exists and allows the lover to resist parts of the world that are judged to be wrong or inadequate or evil. Thus, the love of the world is not simply, to love the world is not simply to passively accept the world, but to join oneself to it, to care about it while wanting it to change. Amor mundi is a personal disposition towards the world that joins one in gratitude without resigning oneself to evil in the world. This means that amor mundi is an active rather than passive love. One must work at it. Arendt loves only her friends insofar as friendship is the love of a tiny micro-world of the friends. Loving the tiny micro-world of the friends means that one can both have a unity or a harmony with the friend and disagreements and arguments with the friend and with their opinions. This is a love that can be distinguished from other forms of love, such as romantic love, loves that shut the world out. Arendt also often wrote of the love of amor volo ut sis, which means I love you, I want you to be. This means loving someone as they are, being grateful that they are as they are, but also being willing to speak against their opinions or their faults. Hannah Pitkin writes that this phrase means that, quote, I will your being just as you are, recognizing your weaknesses and your capacities, realistically affirming your unique individuality, end quote. This is an acceptance of someone as they are, but again, it's not a passive acceptance. It's a resistive gratitude aimed at them, which means it does not accept everything that they do or say. If I will that someone be, I will that they be as a being who exists over time and not as a static object, but as a unique, ever-changing and yet consistent individual. To think of a friendship as a tiny micro-world of its own also allows us to talk about friendship without overgeneralizing or over-theorizing it. If friendship is a little world of its own, within which the friends are both grateful and resistant, then we can see how someone like Hannah Arendt had so many idiosyncratic, particular friendships, within which she could show different parts of herself to different people, or talk about different things with different people, as we see her do in her letters. The result of this is that each of us can be part of many tiny micro-worlds. Each micro-world has its own norms, its own atmosphere, its own pace. So in my thesis, I suggest that we can understand friendship as the love of a tiny micro-world, shared exclusively by the friends. This is a sort of limited public that occurs in private. And it's very different from the way Arendt thinks the social is the private overgrown into the public realm. As a public that occurs in private, friendship is a space in which we test our opinions before we take them to the public realm more properly, which is a much riskier endeavour because we haven't necessarily reached a harmony or an agreement with those that we are speaking with in the public realm proper. So something might hurt in that realm. Friendship as a love of the world is a private and deeply personal disposition that one must work at personally, but also has public elements such as I've said, equalization, disagreement, appearing. To love the friend or to love the tiny micro-world of the friendship is to be grateful for the friend and the friendship, which is what creates the unity while also being resistive to the opinions and actions of the friend. It is to say, I love the friendship and those in it, and I want it to be.
Jumping right on.
Sure.
I think I'm going to have to read off my screen because my printer doesn't want us
You're on.
to see 1/3 of 1/3 of this. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Alex, for starting us off with that. Listening to you speak, I realized that my talk is about a group of people very anxious about the idea that they could be friends with another group, at least in the context of political solidarity. I'm working on my dissertation, and what I'm presenting here is just one kind of thread that I've noticed throughout it, so I'm going to try to pull that out of 2 chapters. So my research tracks and analyzes the self-described radical reformulations of institutionalized liberal social change projects. So things like human rights, development, philanthropy, yay! As they respond to the rise of left and right populisms across the globe and the shrinking of civil space. So some critics have pointed out that these practices and discourses tend to depoliticize potentially radical political actors. This often comes as a critique of liberalism. Whereas others hold out hope of redeeming them as a more robust, less minimal political tool. So there's a lot of talk about repoliticizing human rights or development, often drawing on radical democratic theories. Few, however, I believe have actually engaged with the efforts that already exist within human rights development and philanthropic institutions to become more political, to politicize themselves. So little attention has been paid to the ways that the progressive movement within the third sector in the global north has, over about the past 2 decades, produced its own analyses of the limitations of liberal social change projects and advocated for the use of tools designed to direct their institutional power towards more transformational outcomes. While these actors have deployed a range of discourses to this end, perhaps the most prominent is an investment in the idea of supporting social movements. So you see this in, since about the early to mid 2000s, in the publications of progressive US-based funders like the Ford Foundation, the Global Fund for Women, American Jewish World Service. There's a whole community of them that have had conferences around this question, that are sharing knowledge about how to do this. And have begun to advocate for funding grassroots movements instead of more established NGOs. So, in other words, Black Lives Matter, not the ACLU. The women's rights movement, not Amnesty International. This is kind of just a way to mark this shift. So I think that examining this turn to movements by elite institutions can teach us something about how the near future of liberalism in times of overlapping and accelerating crises and growing populist energies will involve a pull to reimagine it as a more ambitious project, one made to the measure of the problems at hand. What happens when liberal political ethical discourses are re-articulated to be at the service of different, perhaps more radical, political projects? What conceptual and rhetorical work is done in the name of this revitalized liberalism? How can philanthropic foundations that house privatized wealth, for example, support movements that are avowedly anti-capitalist? And what practices and ideas are generated in the attempt to navigate such a contradiction? So I see a lot of what I'm tracking as coming out of a kind of recognition of certain contradictions. So to approach such questions, I try to think through the political rationality of the tools that progressive funders are developing in order to support social movements. So, and I'm going to today just talk about two of them. One is participatory grant making, and one is the social change ecosystem framework. So practice one, participatory grant making. If contemporary progressive social movements tend to confront unfettered privatization and the political and social consequences of neoliberal globalization, how can a prototypical institution of privatization, the philanthropic foundation, support movements? So this contradiction is often presented by critical third sector professionals and scholars in terms of its consequence, the co-optation of movements by liberal elites and their institutions. So the C word, the co-optation idea, is spoken about frequently in webinars that are hosted by these institutions these days. How do we avoid it? So while there have been several responses to the problem of co-optation, an increasingly popular one is participatory grant making, the involvement of grantees or other representatives of the target community in deciding the allocation of grant money. In 2018, it was named the most promising sector reform effort by Inside Philanthropy. The major organizations, including the Ford and MacArthur Foundations, have called for its adoption and developed their own pilot programs. And an active participatory grant-making community with over 700 members was established in March 2020 to build a set of best practices. So I think that two interconnected rationalities undergird participatory grant-making's promise to circumvent co-optation. The first I call non-instrumental relationality, and pardon the clunky terms. This is dissertation world, right? So I'm just making up these things. So advocates for participatory grant-making are trying to redefine the relationship between power, expertise, and experience in ways that make it difficult in theory for elite foundation staff to wield knowledge as power over those disadvantaged individuals and communities who are the object of philanthropic largesse. As evident in sector reform campaigns, progressive funders have started to insist on the unique agency and insight of the subaltern. They turn to the discourse of experience to do so, arguing through a kind of standpoint epistemology that lived experience of marginalization provides the disadvantaged with a knowledge of the solutions to social ills that is simply inaccessible to elites. While grantmakers acknowledge the need to understand the problems their grantees face, they simultaneously and intentionally resist producing knowledge that might facilitate an instrumental relationship between grantmaker and grantee. This is because philanthropic foundations gain legitimacy through proximity to and association with progressive movements emerging out of these communities, but they risk losing it if they fail to maintain a certain distance from them. The second rationality evident in participatory grant-making discourse is the non-hegemonic control of resources. So this idea is premised on the possibility of liberating capital from the hands of hegemonic elites and reformulating it as a neutral resource available to the disadvantaged. For example, in the recent texts of philanthropic thought leader Edgar Villanueva, capital is said to be liberated through the self-critique of foundation elite, who are called upon to reckon with their own privilege and renounce their ill-gotten control over wealth. In Villanueva's influential work, Decolonizing Wealth requires the beneficiaries of historical injustice, such as foundation elites, to perform humility and complicity by specifying how it is that their relationship to wealth has compromised their ability to see the world clearly, to recognize that they are blinded by their own interests. This complicity needs to be named and then located in the person of the elite professional so that the capital they control can be recognized as itself neutral and therefore ripe for redeployment as medicine capable of healing the world, in Villanueva's terminology. So you'll see that the word capital is used when these resources are attributed to the foundations, but the word resources is used when it's used by activists or grassroots communities. So both non-instrumental relationality and the non-hegemonic control of resources are necessary for participatory grant-making to effectively neutralize the possibility of elite co-optation through a conceptual partitioning of the space of capital, associated with elites and experts, and the space of authentic political action, associated with the grassroots and with experience. Together, these rationalities articulate the vision of authentic politics as fully autonomous and self-directing, free from traces of instrumentalism, hegemony, or market influence. So practice 2, the social change ecosystem. Given this privileged positioning of grassroots knowledge, what role is left for progressive elites and their institutions, in their eyes? So while participatory grant-making is a way for third sector elites to cultivate distance between themselves and what they figure as more authentic political actors, the social change ecosystem framework offers a way for these elites to articulate their proximity to authentic politics. It refers to the interrelation of differentiated movement tactics and actors, including mass protest, community organizing, personal transformation, government lobbying, litigation, service provision, and advocacy. It is a conceptual metaphor describing an ideal of solidarity. It's a framework to guide sector reform, and it's a practical tool for mapping relationships between different kinds of organizations. So a prominent example of the social change ecosystem is the version popularized by the Aine Institute, a self-described social movement incubator, through their Momentum training program, which was started in 2014 by Carlos Saavedra and Paul Engler. So Paul and his brother Mark Engler's 2016 book, This is an Uprising, provides the conceptual scaffolding for these trainings. Their intellectual project is to move past the disagreements between 3 social change traditions by reframing them as complementary methodologies. So the first tradition, community organizing, works through individual recruitment, leadership development, and institution building to incrementally build power over time. The second tradition, momentum-based movements, use mass protest, broad-based disobedience, and disruption to attract and politicize new participants and unnerve elites. And the third tradition, prefigurative politics, refers to the creation of alternative institutions like co-ops and community kitchens and radical bookstores that are critical in laying the groundwork for future revolts. The Englers propose an integrated approach that synthesizes these traditions through the ecosystem metaphor. So successful efforts to create change, they write, quote, tend to see themselves as part of an ecology that is made healthier when different traditions each contribute. Mass mobilizations alter the terms of the political debate and create new possibilities for progress. Structure-based organizing helps take advantage of this potential and protects against efforts to roll back advances. And countercultural communities preserve progressive values, nurturing dissidents who go on to initiate the next waves of revolt. While these momentum trainings are geared towards activists, they were used a lot by Black Lives Matter activists, for example. In the summer of 2018, the framework was introduced to funders in an influential report called Funding Social Movements and a series of articles in the Stanford Social Innovation Review. The first thing to note about the social change ecosystem is how hard it works to imagine a cooperative, progressive political whole. So the framework can be traced back to a branch of organizational theory in the 1970s called organizational ecology, which started to cross-pollinate with social movement theory in the 1990s. In that original literature, the organizational ecology work, conflict between different organizational forms is a natural feature of the ecosystem. It's basically market principles. However, when the ecosystem idea is taken up by third sector progressives in the 2000s, this competition, like the co-optation before it, appears as a problem. To resolve the problem of conflict between different kinds of organizations, they are described as fulfilling particular but complementary functions, rather than being defined by potentially incompatible economic and political interests of the actors within them. And this cooperationist theory of ecosystem dynamics harkens back to an earlier sort of organismic thinking in earlier 20th century ecological thought. The second thing to note is the nature of the function progressive elites assign themselves within that ecosystem. So they say we each have these different functions that have to work together, and they often distinguish their function from that of conservative foundations. So conservative foundations see elites at the head of a system of organizations, including universities, think tanks, and citizen groups. So the Kochs famously kind of explicitly named this as their methodology, that work together to implement their specific policy priorities. Progressive foundations differently look to grassroots social movement actors as a vital element at the center of the larger progressive social change organism that provide its direction and ideological cohesion. In other words, its telos and its unity. The task for progressive elites then becomes the regulation of the ecosystem so that the different players in the movement do not enter into competition with each other. So you'll see in their grant-making announcements how carefully they try to insist that activists shouldn't be competing with other NGOs or other foundations for the specific pockets of money. Okay, conclusions and questions. Because participatory grant-making in the social change ecosystem framework predetermined the role of elites in social change as an instrument to be used by grassroots actors to help concretize their visions, the task for these elites becomes the identification of an authentic political actor to follow, right? The task becomes a search for this political element, this authentic political element. This helps us understand a set of left progressive discourses circulating today, including movement lawyering, aligning foundation assets with grantee values, identifying leaders with lived experience. These discourses and practices are about discerning and then paying deference to more authentic political actors. But in this, of course, elites reveal themselves to be much more than instruments used by grassroots actors, for they are in fact active in formulating and defining the political itself in their search for it. While much more can be said, some preliminary features of this definition of authentic politics include the autonomy of the political, for example, its distance from the economic and the juridical, the obscurity and incalculability of the political, for example, the inability of elites to fully access and therefore co-opt it, the disinterestedness of the political, for example, grassroots activists are said to act in the interests of all of humanity compared to elites who have particular rather than universal interests, and the permanence and fragility of the political. For example, it is described as infrastructural to civil society, something that's just part of this organism, it's just a function within it, but also something perpetually at risk of being co-opted, tainted, diminished. The questions I'm now pursuing include: what kind of knowledge is constructed in order to recognize this political authenticity, these types of actors? What are the costs of purifying the political of the juridical and economic? In other words, when we ontologize the authentically political subject, link that subject to an essentialized figure of the social movement, and require of it a degree of autonomy from elite influence that is perhaps impossible to achieve, what are the consequences? What does this do to our ability to imagine, for example, solidarity across different experiences? And what unexpected possibilities for political action might it open up? Thank you. Do you want to sit here?
Also, you can sit here. Yeah, you can sit here. Thank you. Yes.
So we present, I present now and
Yes,
then we have a
that's
discussion.
how you
Okay.
get. I
Oh,
introduced everyone at the beginning.
Okay.
We all know who
And
you are.
so glad that you could make it, Mirka.
Yeah, sorry for being late. I had problems with the train.
Shit happens.
So I didn't hear your presentation. That's not okay. I would like to have heard it. Yeah. So my title of my dissertation is Common Sense, Hannah Arendt as a material media theorist. And as it indicates, I have tried to interpret her as a material media theorist, more precisely to focusing on her concept of common sense that I have tried to kind of reconceptualize with the help of Hannah Arendt. And according to my interpretation of the concept, it could be understood as a concept to politicize mediated relationship between material earth and the humanly shared world. And hence it kind of can broaden the media ecological perspective from the examination of the socio-technical relations to the examinations of material dependencies of current technoculture or so-called technocapitalism. And in my thesis I have also completed this media theoretical interpretation of Arendt's common sense by bringing it into conversation with two other concepts. Firstly, with the concept of Gaia, that has become a hot topic in the discussions concerning Anthropocene in the technology studies and posthumanism. And secondly, with the aesthetic theory of politics, especially with the philosopher Jack Pansier's concept of dissensus, or distribution of the sensible. And by drawing from these thinkers who might seem quite distant to each other, I have tried to think concepts to understand the relation between material and technology as a political problem. And I think that it's current at the time when we have these huge environmental problems in which the expanding media infrastructure is also involved. But often this infrastructure is experienced and understood very immaterially and virtually. So how much I have time? It's like
You have 10 minutes.
10 minutes, okay. So I maybe shortly define the Anthropocene as a media theoretical problem, and then I describe shortly about the material turn in media studies that has happened during last 2 decades, and after that I explain my interpretation of common sense and dissensus. So the Anthropocene is basically an unofficial name for the current geological epoch. Many geologists and the earth system scientists suggest that along with the Industrial Revolution and the great acceleration of the Second World War, human effect to the earth system has become so significant that it has led to a new geological epoch called Anthropocene. And in the situation where geological and social history determine each other's destinies, Anthropocene is not only an issue of scientific modeling, but also a very current political problem that would demand quick political decision making, but also it kind of forces humans to find more sustainable ways to understand their relationship to the earth. And one of the most common philosophers who have tried to do this is Bruno Latour, who has pointed out that the Anthropocene is not only a matter of facts, but also a matter of concern. And through this formulation, he wants to emphasize the epistemological problem concerning Anthropocene does not concern the validity of facts, but the inadequacy of the objective point of view. And basically this means that the scientific facts can give information about the condition of the earth, but they cannot solve the problems that are truly political. And he says that there is no an abstract meta perspective to observe Anthropocene and its crisis from the safe distance, since we all are involved as such. And his critique falls upon the classical humanism and Western political tradition itself, and the metaphysical presumptions of nature and culture as a hierarchical and ontologically separate categories turn out to be untrue in Anthropocene. In the social sciences, Anthropocene has got a number of new names such as Technocene, Olicanthropocene and Anglocene that do emphasize that the changes in the earth system are inseparable from the social developments and ideologies. The key question in new materialistic discussions about the Anthropocene in recent years have been how to think of the earth not only as an object of natural sciences but as a political entity. And Latour argues that the complex and ambiguous figure of Gaia offers an ideal way to disentangle the ethical, political, theological and scientific aspects of now obsolete notion of the earth. it is kind of his ways to understand the human entanglement to the earth. And the so-called material turn that has happened in social sciences and humanities that have tried to redefine the human action, and it's like that refine the agency in a way during the past 2 decades, have also got a variety of forms also in media studies, and these approaches have examined, for example, materiality of technologies concerning not only the social impact of media technologies but also their intertwining with the geo and biophysical processes like satellite grab and energy consumption and electronic waste and so on, and the problems of mining industry. And in addition to the old media ecology, researchers have begun to talk about new media ecology and media geology that offer a theoretical methodology to understand how production and consumption of media technologies evolved to the event of Anthropocene. And even though the digital media infrastructure is often represented as some kind of option to the post-oil capitalism, this kind of quick time of digital culture is deeply tied with the deep time of geological time and history. And and this question has been taken seriously also in media philosophy, and that in the approaches that consider natural elements such as water, air, fire, earth, and ozone as mediums have come to the fore. And in the elemental media philosophy, medium and media is understood in its etymological sense as something among or in the middle of two entities, as a substance regarded as means of transmission of a force or effects. And these approaches emphasize that the elemental mediums are the material basis of life, but they also conditions of possibility that anchor our existence of living beings and make life possible in its biological but also social, political and cognitive sense. And this kind of idea of the betweenness is interesting comparing to Arendt's understanding of in-betweenness, I think. Even though the material interpretation is not the most typical way to read Arendt, who is often considered as a human-centered thinker, especially in the field of media studies, where her theory of active life is applied frequently. Her tripartite distinction of vita activa to biological labor, technological work, and political action is still quite often interpreted from the Habermasian perspective, and Arendt is reckoned as a modern political theorist who wanted to protect a free public realm against necessity of labor and instrumentality of work. Even though lately the more phenomenologically oriented readings of her work emphasize codependence and reciprocity of her tripartisan and pay attention also to her view on technology. But by summing up her thinking in the human condition and life of the mind, for her, humans are both conditioning and conditioned beings, and this simply means that according to Arendt, humans are biological thinking and sentient beings. Us biological thinking and sentient beings are dependent on Earth's materiality, that they are also capable to save in unpredictable ways. And like you are familiar with, but as Arendt writes, humans live on the planet Earth, but they also, so to speak, world it by fabricating durable things and acting among other people. And this capacity to build a lasting world and extend their spectatorship in time by fabricating durable things, which can remain here even after us, they are also capable of shaping their material bases in multiple and unpredictable ways. And Arendt was not only concerned about the alienation from the human-shared world and disappearance of the political realm in modern time, but also worried about the alienation from the earth because of the development of technoscientific practices that enable humans to act into the nature. Arendt's suspicion that people can technologically fulfill things that they actually can't understand seems to hit right at the time of the anthropogenic environmental tragedies. And I think this modern alienation from the earth and the world as a disappearance of the can be understood as a disappearance of the common sense, in the sense it was known from the antique to Middle Ages. And thus rethinking the common sense can also help us to better understand human fundamental commitment to the earth that does not belong only to humans. In the academic discussion concerning the Arendt's common sense, the concept primarily refers to the interpersonal experience of shared human world that is precondition of human politics, but its material dimensions is really systematically analyzed. According to my understanding, Arendt understood common sense phenomenologically as a process of mediation between the material earth and human world, and it is constantly transforming sensed experience of shared reality. As she writes, it comes to mean a kind of sixth sense that does not locate in any specific organ, but situates in between, that is outside of each human and non-human beings. It is a materially sensed feeling that other beings, although different than I, share the same reality with me. And I mean, like, this defining of common sense is always political, since it inherently asks who we count as part of the common. And to underline this political dimension of common sense, I have connected my interpretation of Arendt's common sense to politics aesthetic theory, especially to Rancière's idea of political dissensus. And his radical idea of politics actively challenges liberal democratic theory of politics that can approve only a certain disagreement, that is rational argumentation in the public realm. But for Rancière, the question of whose voice is counted as a human articulation in public realm and whose voice is excluded from it as an animal noise is political question par excellence. And actually for Rancière, there is politics only when this excluded part of society that he calls partless part becomes a political subject and start to demand equal treatment by manifesting that the experience is not taken seriously and arguments are not heard. And this partless part can be any kind of minorities or discriminate groups, even the people itself. Rancière's idea of political dissensus is often applied to theorize the meaning of demonstrations in democratic societies. And he himself limits the emergence of politics only in the context of community of speaking animals, that is humans. But I think that this political dynamic between society and its excluded parts are not necessarily or primarily linguistic by its nature. For Rancière, politics starts from the sense perception, from that very moment when we see, hear, or touch one thing instead of another. And by this concept distribution of the sensible, he tries to describe the order of perceptual reality. And I think it is kind of learned aesthetic scheme that channels perceptions. And hence for Rancière, politics a way to destabilize the distributions of the sensibles by disturbing the current orders of reality. And by applying his idea of political dissensus, it becomes possible to conceive the trembling earth and current environmental tragedies I think they could be understood as an act of political dissensus that demand humans to broaden current human-centric understanding of common sense. And this common sense and dissensus in this material sense creates a constant dynamic that can help to fight against numbness towards the earth and the human beings. And it's non-human beings, I mean. And yeah, so I mean, these concepts can also applied when one wants to politicize material interdependencies of media culture. For example, recent innovations of virtuality like metaverse are not separate realities but dependent on soil and its metals and rare minerals that are tried to find that have to be find in a deep sea or even in moon or something. But yeah, I think I spent my time already, but I hope you got something. I have basically these three concepts that I have tried to do something. Yeah.
Thank you so much.